And welcome everybody to the 2021 International Clarinet Association Research Competition. I'm Jane Ellsworth. I'm the Research Competition Coordinator. I'd like to introduce our panel of judges and thank them very much for their service. We have Liz Alexander, we have Lori Baruth, and Antoine Clark. Thank you so much for serving as judges for this competition. And we have 5 presenters from different parts of the world, which I'm really, really glad to say. We have someone from the Canary Islands, we have a presenter from Brazil, and we have 3 presenters from the United States. So welcome to all our presenters. And let's begin with Kristine Dizon, whose paper is called Breaking the Glass Ceiling, Works for Clarinet and Piano by Holmes, Grandval, Tailleferre, Aubin, Rueff, and Gotkovsky. Kristine, let me make you co-host so that you can share your screen. And I think you should be able to start now.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Jane.
Yeah.
So we will go right here. Oops, sorry, hang on. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, fabulous. So, welcome to my presentation. So the research that I have done relates to the composers that Jane had introduced for me. Thank you so much. So the research that I've done is both applied and interpretive that will also address the political and cultural history that each of the selected composers experienced in chronological order. Historical inclusivity and social class will be discussed along with the connecting modern ideas of how each of the selected composers broke the glass ceiling in paving the way for future generations of female composers. The purpose of this research study is not only to shed light on repertoire that is relatively unknown to performers, but to communicate its historical and pedagogical value to the clarinet literature. This study provides a different perspective on French clarinet repertoire and an opportunity to learn more about the unique history of female composers from France from a musically inclusive and cultural perspective. These are the composers that will be discussed in today's presentation. And you're probably wondering why? Why should we care? And the reason why is because female composers have been overlooked throughout our known history. So in comparison to other artistic disciplines at the time, the societal conditions women composers faced in France during the 19th century actually made it almost impossible to learn or even compose music. If one puts their accomplishments within the context of the 19th century, what they were able to accomplish was actually remarkable, was actually fantastic. And also, too, that they were able to have their works performed publicly. The reason why I had began doing this research was when I had studied in France, I had been exposed to Augusto Holmes's music. It was the first time, actually, as an adult, that I had been exposed to a French woman composer, and which inspired me to want to learn more about this. So throughout this presentation, I will uncover why we didn't hear more about these composers who had written for the clarinet and piano. So why is it important? Well, the women composers selected for this case study were those who had written specifically for this instrumentation. This research is important to not only shed light to understanding the narrative of French women composers who wrote for the clarinet and piano, but also the impact they had on music during their lifespans and how they were able to pave the way for composers, for women composers in the 20th century. So in order to provide a little bit of context, I am going to be providing a brief history. So when we look at the 19th century, women performers and composers had been overlooked, in part because they were considered non-citizens. So what that meant was that they didn't have the right to vote. They didn't have control over their finances once they had gotten married. A lot of the money would be forfeited to their husbands. They did not have the same rights or liberties as men did. Societies and schools allowed women to play instruments and represented what was considered feminine. Now, this meant that women were only limited to singing and piano. There were few women who had performed the clarinet prior to the 20th century because it went against the ideas of this idea of femininity. So according to Hyacinthe Ravet, she stated that the clarinet demands breathing, distorts the face of the player, and allows drops of condensation to escape between the spread part of legs. So because of these characteristics, this idea of distortion, the portray of women, this is part of the reason why for a lot of the history of the clarinet that women were excluded from this part. And so during the 19th century, women participating in music composition, well, what you could say wasn't as bad. They were able to compose music because it didn't violate this idea of public depictions of femininity in a male-dominant field. There were not many female composers in France, and like their counterparts in literature, they often had to publish under pseudonyms or male aliases, which was considered common practice during this era so that it would increase the chances that their music would be performed, as it was considered unusual and outside of societal norms. So now when we look at the interwar period of France, it had a profound impact on the social and cultural changes in the private and public life of women. According to Louise Roberts, French women who lived in the public sphere maintained the femininity expected of them as bourgeois women, even while claiming spaces in traditionally male domains, such as authorship, publishing, and other professions. While Grandval and Holmes were not alive when women were provided more rights in France, these changes started to happen during the lifespans of Tailleferre, Aubin, Rueff, and Gotkovsky. The first composer that I'll be discussing is Clemens De Granval. She was born in 1828 and had died in 1907. She was born into a wealthy family in the Château de la Cour du Bois. She had began her musical studies early on, and she composed many works. Actually, out of all of the composers, she had the most aliases out of all of them and pseudonyms due to her social position. In part because she was a countess. It was actually seen worse for her to be publishing and composing music. So that was part of the reason why she had published under different names. She had studied music with Frédéric Chopin, and her output includes 3 symphonies, 2 concertos, a concert overture, ballet music, among others. So unfortunately, because of time, I will not be able to share recordings with you, but I am more than happy to send this presentation to anyone who is interested in listening to the recordings. The piece that she wrote was called Deux Pièces, 2 pieces in English. So the piece number 1 that she had written was the Invocation, or Invocation, and the piece number 2 was the Air Slave. So this work was composed in 1881, published in 1885 by Grandval herself. It was dedicated to French composer Léon Grisset. And the work itself can be performed in together or in separate movements. It's actually a really great piece to give to the intermediate level students. It's also something that would be great to program even for the professional level. And it's still published today actually through the Édition Combre. So I really recommend it. It's very short, but it's actually, there's a lot of really rich content in the how she writes the different melodies and harmonies. So the following composer that I will be discussing is Auguste Holmes. So she was born in 1847 and died in 1903. She had a shorter life than most of the composers that I discussed in the study. She was a French composer of Irish descent. Initially, when she was a kid, she wasn't allowed to study music because her mom was really against it. And so what happened, unfortunately, when her mother had passed, when she was 11 years old, she was actually able to pursue studies in music. So throughout her career, she actually began her studies with César Franck. She was also influenced by Wagner's music, and she was known in many aristocratic circles for her music and personality. So she was one of the composers that I would say had defied many cultural expectations through her compositions. Women who had participated in composing during this time period were expected to write songs and salon pieces, whereas actually Holmes, she produced these large symphonies. She wrote symphonic poems, choral works, 2 operas, and many songs. And actually, as a result of that, a lot of her critics had labeled her music as masculine and virile. So it's one of those things that really, she was a force of her time. One of the career highlights that she had was that she had composed Ode Triomphale for the 1889 exposition Universelle in celebrating the centennial of the French Revolution. So she was really inspiring, at least for me, in her work. The piece that she had written was the Fantasy for Clarinet et Piano. This was composed in 1900 and dedicated to the French clarinetist César Rose, who was actually the professor of clarinet at the Paris Conservatory. This piece was actually also selected as a competition piece. And so today it's still published through the Édition Musicale Fortin en Main. And for this type of piece, this is something that I would definitely give to someone at the intermediate level, just because it has a variety of the different characters. We have a fast part, of a slow part, very expressive parts of the music. And because of that type of character development she has in her fantasy, which is written in free form, that it really teaches students and can also be a great way of talking about different parts of musicality. So this is actually a really great piece if you ever have a chance to listen to it. So now the next composer that I will be discussing is Jamal Khayefer, who was born in 1892 and had died in 1983. She was actually born Marcel Jamal Tailleferre. Well, you're probably wondering, is that a spelling error, Kristine? Well, actually, no. What happened was she had a very difficult relationship with her father, who actually disapproved of her participation in music. And so as a result of that, when she became a young woman, she actually changed the S to an R. And so she actually became known as Tailleferre. So she later became known as the only female member of Les Six. And so that was actually a blessing and a curse at the same time. It was a blessing because her music became internationally known. But it was also a curse because within Les Six, because she was the only female composer, a lot of the time she would be compared to her male colleagues and was often labeled as one of the least talented members of Les Six. A lot of her music was labeled as feminine also, and so I'll go more into that as we go. Her output consisted of symphonies, symphonic poems, choral works, 2 operas, and many songs. So despite the difficulties that she had in her personal life, her private life, she was still very active musically towards the end. And so I really enjoy her music too. So when we use these words to describe music by male or female composers, I want to bring your attention to this part of the quote. So this is taken from Jamal Khayefer. She said, "I tried the best I could, but I never asked myself if it was feminine or not. If it is music, it is music." And to follow that, her colleague, Georges Auric, also had agreed with her in this context. I don't know what music is, feminine music is. If I listen to a work of Jamal Khayefer's that I consider to be successful, I do not ask if it is masculine or feminine. It is music, and good music. That's good enough for me. So when we oftentimes, even though we start seeing progress, we still see these types of adjectives being connected to female composers or women composers, you can say, during this period of time. Now, the Arabesque, this is actually a work that was composed in 1972 by Tailleferre and dedicated to French clarinetist Désiré Dandin, that uses thematic material from her opera La Petite Sirène as the basis of the Arabesque. So she was known for borrowing themes within her music, and so she had used it as part of the basis of that. It is still published today through Carl Fischer. So this is actually a really great recording. He's actually a good friend. I highly recommend it if you have a chance. All right, so oops, I'll go right here. Now, this to talk more about this idea of attitudes that were prominent in the 20th century. This is a quote that I found from Aaron Copland on music. Towards the end, he says, everyone knows that the high achievement of women musicians as vocalists and instrumentalists has no counterpart in the field of musical composition. This historically poor showing that has puzzled more than one observer. It is even more inexplicable when one considers the reputation of women novelists and poets, of painters and designers. Is it possible that there is a mysterious element in the nature of musical creativity that runs counter to the nature of the feminine mind? And yet there are more women composers than ever writing today, writing, moreover, music worth playing. The future may very well have a different tale to tell for the present. However, no woman's name will be found on the list of world famous composers. So despite having received the right to vote in 1944 with increased opportunities for music education and a general acceptance of women composers in France, these were the attitudes that were prominent within the 1960s. That said, while it could be true, everyone's entitled to have their own opinion. This idea of world famous composers was not just because of, oh, there's no one able or capable to write. It's in part because they were not provided the tools, education, and opportunities early on in history as their male counterparts to achieve this type of acclaim, and that perhaps he didn't have an association with Tailleferre, who was actually living when this book was published. So the following composer that I will be discussing is Jeanna Jouev. She was born in 1922 and had died in 1999. There's actually not a lot of information about Jeanna. She lived a very private life, but what was known was that she was a student of Henri Bousset at the Paris Conservatory of Music. She worked also as an assistant to Marcel Müller and Ulysse Delecluse at the Paris Conservatory. Later on, she was appointed a professor of sight singing and harmony at the same institution. She was known for having composed for saxophone, sax horn, clarinet, and cornet, and a lot of her works were used for contests. Now, this is a personal favorite of mine also, the Concertina Opus 15. So this was composed and published in 1915 and actually dedicated to Ulysse Delecluse and was used as a competition piece. This is actually a really great recording by Franck Amé that I hope you would enjoy, and it's still published today through Alphonse Leduc. Now, for a piece like this, this is something that I would give to someone who is advanced and has really great technique. It's very demanding, and but it's actually very exciting at the same time. So this is something that I would give to advance or even recommend to other professional players. Now, as I continued discussing composers within the 20th century, the next composer that I will be discussing is Francine Aubin, who lived from 1938 to 2016. She was very musically gifted from an early age, and she had won the first prize of composition at the Paris Conservatory at age 20. She was also the wife of Tony Aubin, who was actually the professor of composition at the same conservatory. She was actually a very profound woman. She was very active and was considered the first woman to be director of CA, Certificat d'Aptitude, in 1969, and named director of the Conservatoire de Toussaint and later Roy Malmaison. There was a period of her time where she didn't compose for 3 years, as she was also a painter, but then she later returned to composition as she found that was her passion. She had written symphonies, symphonic poems, choral works, and 2 operas, along with many songs. Now, the piece that she had written specifically for the clarinet and piano was Deux pièces en forme de jazz. So right here, it was originally for clarinet and piano and was composed for the Collection Clarinet series for Michel Arignon. This is actually with the intention of writing for intermediate musicians, intermediate level students. It's actually a really well-written piece that could be easily programmed in a recital or a concert, and also for school concerts also. This piece is also available through Robert Martin. I do want to note that she, towards the end of her life, she had written a clarinet concerto for Philippe Coubert with string orchestra that was later reduced for clarinet and piano. So that is actually really excellent if you have a chance to check it out. Now, the final composer that I'll be discussing is Ida Gotkovsky. She is still alive. Yay! She was born into a musical family and studied at Paris Conservatory, where her teachers were Nadia Boulanger and Olivier Messiaen. She's actually currently a professor of music theory at the Paris Conservatory. Her output includes chamber music, symphonies, instrumental music, vocal music, ballets, and operas. Now, that said, she did write a lot for the clarinet, but the piece that I had found that she had written for clarinet and piano was Images de Norvège and the Chanson. But because of time, I'll be speaking briefly about the Images de Norvège. So this consists of two movements, two short movements, Dolcissimo and Fantasque. It was composed in 1977 and published in 1980 by Gerard Biaudot editor, and was dedicated to the French clarinetist Guy Dangan. They were actually friends while they were students at the Paris Conservatory, and it's actually still published today. There's not a lot of performances of this piece. I would definitely, if I were to say who would this be for, I would definitely say for advanced players, just because it's very technical. Oops, sorry, didn't mean to redo that. Now, with the conclusion, it is important to contextualize the achievements of women composers from the interwar years, as there was a great deal of hostility to female professionalism, and to understand the reception and criticism of their work as having been shaped by a society in which it was produced, and which perceived career-oriented success by women as unusual. The societal circumstances that Grandval and Holmes faced in the 19th century illustrate how remarkable their achievements were during their lifetime. Their financial circumstances and social position made it possible for them to pursue their passion for music composition through their private studies with composers like César Franck, Frédéric Chopin, and Camille Saint-Saëns. The political and social changes that occurred because of women receiving the right to vote during the interwar years in France helped create opportunities to study music composition and to have their works performed publicly without discrimination. While the music contributions of women composers during the 19th century and interwar period have been overlooked, it is important to understand the individual circumstances living in a time when society viewed women composers as outsiders because they did not fit within the ideals of their feminine identity. The fact that most of the pieces mentioned were dedicated to well-known male French clarinetists, and it had association with the Conservatoire National Supérieur de Paris, Paris Conservatory, helped create more weight and value in their work to get their compositions performed publicly. While these associations are indeed helpful, along with the women receiving increased rights in France, it did not guarantee continued performances of these works, despite the improved circumstances for women composers in the 20th century. The pedagogical value not only lies in the teaching the repertoire, encouraging students and performers to record these works in recitals and concerts, but also raising awareness about how the living conditions of French women composers during the interwar years made it almost impossible for them to pursue their musical ambitions, and how their compositions were devalued and overlooked simply because of their gender, which was considered common practice to publish under male aliases to remove that established bias from the public. The pieces that they had written for the clarinet and piano are a product of not only French women composers who were determined to pursue ambitious careers in music, but symbolic of their achievements despite society naysayers, which is something valuable to the clarinet repertoire. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a race to the finish there, but you made it. Yes. Great. So I'd like to open the floor to any questions the judges might have for Kristine, if there are any.
Kristine.
Hi.
Can you tell me why did you pick these specific women? Was it only because you found them to only write for the clarinet during this period, or were there others?
Well, so a couple of things. I had actually, when I was at living in France, and I was just so amazed. I said, "Oh my gosh, there's a Auguste Holmes. She's a French female composer. I need to learn more." And actually, there's actually quite a few of. There's actually Louise Farinck, Betsy Jolas, and those people. But the thing is, I wanted to be able to also narrow down my focus a little bit. So for the case study, because I wanted to learn more about the clarinet and piano, and actually program works for the clarinet and piano. And so within what I was able to find, these were really the only people that wrote for this instrumentation. I mean, when you look at Ida, she's amazing. I actually had an opportunity to talk to her a little bit before being able to do this presentation, and it's amazing, the lives, the body of work that she had composed for the clarinet. I mean, she has written larger works like the sonata, her concertos for clarinet also. But that's also something too, to be able to narrow it down. This is why I had found these composers. So so I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Liz?
I have a question too. You mentioned a couple of times talking about pedagogically that this would be good for an intermediate student or advanced student. Can you elaborate on what your definition of intermediate and advanced are?
Well, when we think about this, I mean, I guess it's a very personal, take on what we consider intermediate, beginner, advanced, professional. At least from my personal experiences here in Europe, I mean, it is the expectation that the people have memorized their scales, that they memorize their thirds, that children actually do this all from the memory. Now, that said, putting that into context of different places in the world, it's not always the same. And so for me, there is that type of flexibility within intermediate. It's not saying, well, unless you've done Rubenk book number 3, it must be like this, right? But being able to say, well, this piece uses major scales, which is something that I think students should be able to know. This piece also has uses thirds, uses interrupted scales. But now, when we talk about music for the advanced level, for example, with Ida and with what I had mentioned with Jeanna Jouev, oh wow, I mean, that's hard. Okay, so it's like with all of these accidentals, with all of going into the altissimo of being able to play everything at a ridiculously fast tempo, being able to achieve that virtuosity. And unfortunately, I didn't have the time to be able to explain that in the presentation, that if you look at the level of difficulty of their pieces over this time period, it just got harder and harder and harder type of thing. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
Other questions?
I just have a quick question. Have you guys the opportunity to play all of these pieces?
I've had the opportunity to play the fantasy. I've also have had the opportunity to work the Rueff. Unfortunately, because of COVID, I haven't been able to play concerts and do a lot of things within the last year. But I hope to be able to actually learn all of the repertoire that I had mentioned. I have them all, including the chanson for Ida, and be able to record it, to make a recording of it. So de Piste and Jazz, you have to, it's like really cool. I mean, but then again,
I'll have to check it out. They all sound really fun.
I have all the scores, but so.
Thank you. Anything else? Okay, well, let's go on to our next presenter. Lacey, this is you, and I forgot to ask you ahead of time how to pronounce your last name. So will you please say your name for us?
It's Golaszewski.
I was going to guess that. Okay, good. So this is Lacey Golashevsky, and her paper is we're going to stick with the French theme here a little bit. It's called Fashioned by Irony: The Life and Clarinet Literature of Eugène Bozza. So I just said my whole little thing. Did you guys hear that? Did I mute myself by accident? You heard that. Okay. Let me let me make you co-host so you can share your screen. Okay, I think we're ready for you to start.
Okay, I can see it. Great. Okay, thank you. Since its creation, the clarinet music of composer Eugène Bozza has enjoyed a highly favorable reputation around the world. His idiomatic writing and accessible music have consistently intrigued performers and listeners alike. Yet, in spite of the permanence of Bozza's music in the clarinet repertoire, there is scant information available about the man himself. Current scholarship focuses upon analysis of his music and provides only limited biographical material. For this reason, countless questions surrounding the composer's life remain unanswered. These include most especially inquiries relating to the paradoxes that pervaded his life. For although Bozza is best known today as a French composer, in his day he was not so regarded. Moreover, while wind chamber repertoire permeates Bozza's oeuvre, he was not a wind musician himself, and chamber music was not his primary devotion. Thus, to remedy the current lacuna of biographical information available on Bozza, this paper presents an exploration of the composer's life through the lens of contradiction. It first details the various ironies in the composer's life, particularly those concerning his national identity, careers, and preferred musical genres. It then shows how these paradoxes influence his clarinet music. In the process, the paper draws upon interviews with Bozza's daughter, Cécile Bozza-Delplace, and several of his colleagues. It also employs findings from the Conservatoire de Valenciennes, of which Bozza was director, his Archive at the Bibliothèque de Valenciennes, and his 300-page orchestration treatise. Ultimately, the paper argues that the paradoxes populating Bozza's life were not incidental to his work for clarinet. Rather, it demonstrates how they define this enduring segment of his oeuvre. Of the paradoxes surrounding Bozza's life, that of his national identity is by far the most entrenched. An account of his birth in Nice, France, to a French woman, Honorée Molina, and the fact that he lived most of his life in France, Bozza is viewed by the majority of scholars and musicians today as a Frenchman. Paul Griffiths, for instance, identifies Bozza as a French composer in Grove music. Authors of various journal articles, music reviews, master's theses, and doctoral dissertations concerning the musician have done the same. However, during his lifetime, Bozza was not considered French, but rather Italian. Florent Schmidt, for example, writing in Le Temps in 1934, placed Bozza in a group of foreign composers working in Paris in the 1930s. André Rat, the composer's colleague, similarly indicated the composer's identity as Italian, pointing to the professional setbacks that he suffered in the years following World War II on account of his perceived foreign identity. Moreover, Bozza himself identified as Italian, according to his daughter. Various factors explain why, in spite of Bozza's French birth, heritage, and residence, many considered him Italian. First, the composer's name, Eugenio Joseph Bozza, reflects this Italian identity, as does the status and heritage of his father, Umberto Bozza, an Italian emigre. Moreover, French law at the time of Bozza's birth, on April 4, 1905, only granted birthright citizenship to those born on its soil, beginning with the third generation in immigrant families. Finally, Bozza was fluent in Italian, having spent approximately 12 years living and studying in Rome. In addition to the misalignment regarding Bozza's national identity, a similar paradox exists concerning his career. Bozza is best remembered today as a wind composer, and wind music makes up the largest share of his repertoire. As a result, live and recorded performances of the composer's work consist almost exclusively of his wind literature, and writers such as Griffiths associate the composer principally with wind music. However, Bozza was not a wind musician himself, but instead enjoyed a multifaceted career centered on violin, opera, and administration. In particular, the composer's life and music commenced at age 5 with violin lessons from his father. The elder Bozza was a professional violinist in the casinos of Montor, Evian, and Nice, as well as the Teatro de Monte Carlo. Following a number of years of study with his father, Bozza furthered his musical development in conservatory settings. After his family emigrated to his father's native Italy in 1915 on account of World War I, he enrolled at the Conservatorio di Santa Cecilia in Rome. There, he continued his studies in violin, as well as piano and solfege, earning the diploma of professor of violin at age 14. While at the Conservatorio, Bozza also studied composition with violinist, composer, conductor, and musicologist Ottorino Respighi. After completing his studies at the Conservatorio, Bozza then returned to France to study violin with Edouard Nadeau at the Paris Conservatory. 2 years later, he won the school's prestigious Premier Prix. By the time that Bozza was 20 years old, he was a virtuoso violinist at the threshold of a performing career. Arturo Toscanini appointed him to the position of concertmaster of l'Orchestre Guadeloupe in 1925. The musician spent the next 5 years performing in France, the Netherlands, Austria, Italy, and Greece, establishing an international reputation for himself as a leading violinist. Bozza also presented numerous solo recitals during these years, performing his own pieces for violin alongside works by Camille Saint-Saëns and Ludwig van Beethoven. In 1930, at age 25, however, Bozza abandoned his international performing career, and after the age of 27, he never played the violin again. Despite the allegation by his wife that stage fright was the reason for his desertion of the instrument, Bozza's daughter and Rat both refute this idea. Instead, they believe Bozza's heart was in conducting and composition, and that he was weary of the substantial time commitment that being a virtuoso violinist entailed, time that he would rather devote to conducting and composing. They indicate all the performances that he gave as a violinist prior to this point, when stage fright did not appear to bother him, as well as the decades of public performances as a conductor that would follow, when he also did not seem to be hindered by stage fright. Once he put down his violin, Bozza embarked on a path that would focus his efforts on opera, conducting, and composition. To initiate this change, Bozza returned to the Paris Conservatory to study conducting with Henri Rabaud. Under Rabaud's tutelage, Bozza won his second Premier Prix, this time in conducting, in 1931 with the unanimous vote of the jury. Then, after spending a brief period as the conductor of Les Ballets Russes de Monte Carlo, the musician returned to the Paris Conservatory in 1932 to study composition with Henri Busset. Bozza won his third Premier Prix, plus the Prix de Rome in composition 2 years later. As a result, Bozza spent 4 years and 5 months at the Villa de' Medici in Rome, honing his compositional skills with Jacques Ibert, Darius Milhaud, and Arthur Honegger. His formal training complete, Bozza returned to Paris in 1938 to focus full-time on conducting. He became the orchestra conductor at the Opéra Comique and remained in the post for nearly 10 years. He also took numerous conducting appointments within France and abroad during this time, including with the Cologne, Guadeloupe, Le Moreau, Pianet, Société de Concert, and Radiodiffusion orchestras, and he became well known as a conductor in Italy, Austria, and Greece as well. In 1948, Bozza's professional life changed drastically when, at 43 years old, he left his post at the Opéra Comique. Bozza's daughter believes financial issues at the institution played a role in his departure. Rat believes that Bozza's dismissal from the Opéra Comique was due to the fact that the French viewed Italians negatively in the years immediately following the war. Fortunately, in 1950, Marcel Landowski appointed Bozza, then age 45, to the post of director of the Valenciennes Conservatory, an event that launched the third stage of Bozza's musical career. His mission was to reorganize the conservatory, located in northeastern France near Lille, during an initial appointment of only a single year. In fact, Bozza held the position for 25 years and greatly enlarged the institution in the interim. During these years, Bozza expanded the curriculum at the school and wrote an abundance of new music for winds. After his retirement from administration, Bozza devoted himself completely to composition, until his death in Valenciennes on September 28, 1991, at the age of 86. In honor of his great contributions to the school, the Valenciennes Conservatory was renamed for Bozza in 2016. Practical motivations explain why, despite his careers as a violinist, opera conductor, and conservatory administrator, Bozza produced the significant quantity of wind music for which he is known today. These catalysts include the solo de concours, or exam solos for potential conservatory graduates. Conservatories typically hired professional composers to create new solos for each instrument every year. To this end, Bozza was commissioned to compose 11 wind solo de concours for the Paris Conservatory, plus 2 for Valenciennes. His Paris Conservatory solo de concours include Récit Sicilien et Rondo, originally featuring bassoon, but also available for clarinet under the title Fantaisie Italienne, plus Bucolique, an original work for clarinet. His solo de concours for Valenciennes include his suite for clarinet. Paris Conservatory likewise championed the writing of etude books to train its instrumentalists. These etudes were intended to develop instrumental technique. As a result, Bozza created 11 collections of wind etudes for institutional use, including 3 for clarinet, his 14 études de mécanisme, 12 études, and 11 études sur des modes carnatiques. During the 1930s and 1940s, Bozza was also a colleague and close friend of Marcel Mule, an internationally renowned classical saxophonist. The 1930s were considered the golden age of the saxophone. Mule's solo career was skyrocketing, and his professional saxophone quartet was thriving. Moreover, in 1942, the Paris Conservatory reopened its saxophone studio under Mule's direction. Mule hence had a great need of quality saxophone music for himself as a soloist, as well as for his quartet and his students, which Bozza provided. Finally, in the years that Bozza ran the Valenciennes Conservatory, due to a long tradition of amateur wind musicians in the surrounding coal mining areas, a disproportionate number of wind students attended it and other nearby conservatories. As there was a dearth of quality wind music available for these students and their teachers, Bozza devoted much of his compositional energies to ameliorating the situation for the students and faculty at the Valenciennes Conservatory and those in neighboring Lille and Roubaix. Among many other wind chamber pieces, Bozza wrote the clarinet pieces Epithalame, La Rhapsodie Niçoise, for Valenciennes clarinet professor André Dufour. Paralleling the irony concerning Bozza's extensive composition for winds, in light of his professional life as a violinist, conductor, administrator, is the paradox surrounding important genres in his career. For while the composer is known for his chamber music, he personally favored grand masterworks, especially those for the stage. Brat and Jean-Claude Poncillon, Valenciennes arts historian and personal friend of Bozza, attest to this fact, as do Bozza's plenitude of non-commissioned stage works. The latter commenced with La Légion de Rachmaninoff, a cantata that the composer created as a student at the Paris Conservatory. They continue with works that he wrote while conductor at the Opéra Comique, specifically his comic opera Beppo ou les morts dont personne ne voulait, his ballets Fête romaine and Jeux de plage, his opera Leonida, and his Messe à la Sentier Pied 12. They also comprise works that Bozza composed while in Valenciennes, in particular his 3 oratorios, La Tentation de Saint Antoine, La Chante de la Mine, and La Passion de Jésus, his Messe solennelle de Sainte Cécile, and his opera La Duchesse de Langeais. Bozza achieved a notable amount of success with these masterworks, particularly during his lifetime. He won the Prix de Rome with La Légion de Rachmaninoff and the Crescent Prize with La Tentation de Saint Antoine, and he saw La Passion de Jésus produced in Valenciennes and La Duchesse de Langeais in Lille. Moreover, Bozza's magnum opus, La Chante de la Mine, a work in homage to the region's coal miners and mining country, premiered in Valenciennes with an astonishing 500 performers and 7 choruses from France and Belgium. After its debut in Valenciennes, the work was later staged at the Opéra de Lille, the Salle Pleyel in Paris, and again in Valenciennes in the 1950s. It was reproduced in Valenciennes in 2018. Practical reasons again explain why, when Bozza clearly preferred grand masterworks, he composed so much chamber music. Commissioned solo de concours and etudes obviously necessitated parts for 1 or 2 performers, but Bozza could have included a significant number of wind band pieces and concerti when addressing the lack of wind music available for conservatory students and faculty. Moreover, Bozza was conductor of l'Orchestre d'Harmonie de Valenciennes and the Philharmonie in neighboring Maubeuge, so he had groups available to perform such music. Yet he only composed one known work for wind band, his Children's Overture, commissioned by the American Wind Symphony Orchestra in 1964. And he only created a handful of concerti featuring winds. These include his Concerto for Clarinet and Chamber Orchestra, written in 1952 and dedicated to Ulysse Delécluze of the Paris Conservatory. Sexual imbalances and general ability levels among its potential performers in Valenciennes and the surrounding areas likely influenced these situations. The royal ensembles could not consistently maintain balanced numbers among their sections, and the Valenciennes Conservatory, as a feeder school for more advanced institutions such as the Paris Conservatory, typically taught students who were in the earlier stages of their musical development, may not yet have been ready to handle the music that Bozza wished to write. Despite these ironies in Bozza's life, his Italian heritage, varied careers, and fondness for expansive stage works nevertheless had profound influences on his clarinet music. In terms of Bozza's Italian identity, evidence of its influence is first apparent in the composer's choice of musical styles in his clarinet pieces. For although analyses of Bozza's works, as well as his orchestration treatise, reveal that he was an eclectic composer who drew upon a vast variety of sources, including the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, Richard Wagner, Duke Ellington, Claude Debussy, and Maurice Ravel, as well as American jazz and Indian Carnatic ragas, or modes for melodic improvisation, he took on the music of Italy perhaps more than anything else. Bozza frequently alluded to Italian pastoral dance styles, such as the Sicilienne and Tarantella, for instance. A Sicilienne is a bucolic dance named for Sicily that exhibits a dotted quarter note, 16th note, 8th note rhythm in compound time. Bozza incorporated the Sicilian rhythm into his aria for clarinet and piano, one of his most popular works, as well as his Fantaisie Italienne and Bucolique, plus his Contraste 3 numéro 8 for clarinet and bassoon. We have some examples of Sicilians in Bozza's works. This last one I'll play. Similarly, a tarantella is a rustic folk dance from southern Italy that features a brisk tempo, 6/8 time, and characteristic rapid triplets. According to the lore, the dance is done to rid the body of the poison from a lycosa tarantula bite. Bozza featured the tarantella in several solo works for clarinet, including Claribel, Bucolique, the Concerto, and Rhapsodie Niçoise. Bozza's scherzo for wind quintet is also based on a tarantella, as is his Lucioles, or Fireflies, for clarinet sextet, which itself derives from the scherzo. Again, some examples of the tarantellas. We'll listen to the last one. Beyond these applications of Italian traditions in his clarinet music, Bozza also incorporated elements from the Italian violin literature that he knew well as a fiddle virtuoso. These include lyrical and virtuosic elements present in much Italian Baroque violin repertoire, such as that of Arcangelo Corelli, Antonio Vivaldi, Giuseppe Tartini, and Pietro Nardini, plus the 19th century solo violin works of Niccolò Paganini. Bozza often employed these stylistic elements first in his own works for violin before developing them further in his wind literature. As an example, in his Caprice No. 7, Paganini provides the solo violin with numerous brisk flourishes that are both legato and virtuosic, as seen here. Bozza supplies similar bravura passages in his Concerto for Violin in 1935. He then applied the same approach in a multitude of works for clarinet, such as his Fantaisie Italienne, Bucolique, Claribel, Concerto, Caprice Improvisation, Epithalame, Suite, and Rhapsody Niçoise, as well as his Ballade for bass clarinet and piano. Here's some examples of the bravura fragments. Listen to this one. Likewise, Bozza drew heavily from the Italian opera with which he was intimately familiar as a conductor. This was particularly so with regard to the bel canto writing found in the music of Respighi, Gioacchino Rossini, Pietro Mascagni, and Giacomo Puccini. On the podium, Bozza harbored a special fondness for the music of Mascagni and Puccini, with its emphasis on clear legato and a beautiful tone. British reviewer S.S. Dale noted that he performed works such as the former's Cavalleria Rusticana and the latter's La Bohème often. Bozza also developed a reputation as a Puccini expert as well, a fact that was especially clear in his music. According to composer, conductor, and pianist Nicholas Slanimsky, Bozza's compositions have, quote, Puccinian qualities, end quote. With regard to his clarinet literature, Bozza applied the bel canto approach found in music, such as that of Puccini, in the aria-like passages of many works. These include the aria section of his Bucolique, as well as the entirety of his self-referentially named aria. Similarly, the composer took a coloratura bel canto approach in the recitatives of many of his clarinet works, such as Fantaisie Italienne and Bucolique. While the influence of Italian opera is most apparent in Bozza's approach to melody in his clarinet music, it is visible in other manners as well. For example, the composer commonly applied fantasia form or free form in much of his clarinet music, whether for entire pieces, individual movements, or cadenzas. According to Seth Brodsky, drawing upon Annette Richards, the fantasia is a vehicle for the aesthetic of fantasy. Moreover, as A.L. Ringer has shown, opera is the, quote, domain of le merveilleux, end quote, or the fantastic. Thus, Bozza's frequent application of the fantasia form in his clarinet music builds upon this operatic tradition. Moreover, Bozza routinely used a specifically sectional fantasia form in these pieces, such that they seemed like dramatic works in miniature, with different sections portraying different scenes or characters. Similarly, he commonly employed exoticist elements such as highly chromatic passages and Indian Carnatic ragas in his music, clarinet music. His Entêtude sur des modes carnatiques, for example, is based entirely on 24 of the 72 Carnatic ragas. He also employed Carnatic ragas extensively in the opening recitative of Bucolique, as heard here. As Timothy Taylor has explained, exoticism was instrumental in the creation of opera as a clearly defined genre. And as shown by Ringer, opera-goers have expected opera to incorporate faraway peoples and places since the genre's inception. Thus, this inclusion of exoticism in Bozza's wind music also builds upon operatic traditions. In sum, while there remains much to be explored with regard to Bozza's life and music, understanding of some of the many paradoxes in his life provides a more nuanced comprehension of his clarinet literature. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lacey. What about questions from the judges? Anything?
So I have a quick question, and forgive me if I didn't catch this. So you said that Bozza considered himself to be more Italian than French?
Absolutely.
Okay, and so we see a lot of that. You showed a lot of examples of his writing having Italian influences, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, are you saying that the paradox is that people other than him consider him a French composer?
Exactly, yes. He's known today as a French composer among scholars and musicians, and sometimes a bit of a shock to some people that he was not considered Italian in his lifetime, and he didn't, was not considered French in his lifetime, and he considered himself Italian.
And did you find that any of the French style imbued his music compositions?
Yeah, I think sort of the neoclassical French approach did certainly influence him. The whole idea that he took elements from a lot of different styles of music that we see in Lacey's and in the music of, say, Ibert and Honegger and Mio, individuals that he studied with at the Villa de' Medici in Rome. That certainly, I think, affect his overall approach to borrowing from a lot of different types of music and putting it together, not so much in a pastiche way, but in a more integrated way, but just the fact that he borrowed from so many different sources. I think we could say that's definitely a French neoclassical influence there.
Right. And the last thing, just for clarification, the point about why he wrote so much for wind players, you're stating that basically this was out of commissions more than he was led to do this because of people wanting him to write the solo de concours. But when he did, he borrowed a lot from string idiomatic techniques to bring over to the winds.
I think from the string writing, yes, not so much the techniques as in how it feels on the instrument, but it's actually well known for how idiomatic his writing is for specific instruments. And we see this a lot in his 300-page orchestration treatise, which I did have a chance to see at his archive in Valenciennes. He really knows the idiosyncrasies of so many instruments really well. What works well, what's a challenge, what's awkward, what sounds well in the hands of a good player. So in that sense, I don't think he was borrowing specific string techniques to put into his wind music, but more of the overall approach to string literature he incorporated into comparable idioms in his music for winds.
Right. I guess I should say some of that influence, it didn't translate, but it influenced him. How can I bring this to the wind instrument in a way?
Definitely, I would agree.
Okay,
with that.
Thank you so much.
Welcome, thank you.
I have a quick question too. You mentioned that most of the research on him has been focusing on analyses, and I was wondering, and as opposed to like the biographical stuff that you've been doing a lot more of, I was wondering if you had any reason why that has been such a focus for him.
I can't say definitively. The number of primarily dissertations that I've read on Bozza, which is where most of the research is, maybe 20 or so, focus either on him or on his music in conjunction with other people for a particular instrument. They tend to recycle the same material. It's all based on the original dissertation in 1978 on some of his bassoon literature. And that's just, you just see recycled in the same dissertations over and over again. It's not expanded upon. It is sort of a challenge to get some of the information. I did have the opportunity to meet with Bozza's daughter and some of his colleagues, as I mentioned, Valenciennes. The challenge with that is Bozza's daughter was born when he was 57. And he was quite a workaholic, so he was not home much when she was growing up. And then she moved out at 15 to go study at the Paris Conservatory. So there was not a lot of overlap, is what I'm saying, when she was growing up. So she really didn't know her father very well. And so as much as she was willing to help me, she just didn't have a whole lot to offer. I mean, she wasn't around when he was writing in his 20s, 30s, 40s, and so forth, and didn't have a lot of contact with him when he was a senior citizen. So it's hard just to get some of the information, as well as with the colleagues that I spoke to, again, very willing to talk to me and provide information. But again, they knew him much later in his life, and him being such a workaholic, he wasn't always talking a lot about what he was doing earlier in his life. So even though they're willing to share, they just don't have a whole lot to share. So I really had to take little bits and pieces from a whole lot of different places and assemble this together. And in that sense, it's been a challenge, something I've been working on for more than 6 years at this point, just to get this amount together, because it's tiny bits at a time, all sort of put together, where you can't just go to one source and there it all is, talking to his daughter or a friend or something. It's really sort of painstaking work that I've been doing. So that's where the challenge is, I think.
Wow. And I guess that leads me to one quick follow-up is, what made you interested in researching him?
Well, I've always been interested in his music. I think on every recital I've done, I've performed at least one piece by Bozza. So as both a clarinetist and a saxophonist, I know that repertoire fairly well. And various chamber groups, wind quintets, wind trios, clarinet quartets, and saxophone quartets. I've gotten to know the chamber literature as well. You just keep playing this stuff and you start to wonder about it. And then when I went looking to find out more information, there just wasn't that much available. So one thing led to another, and I talked to some of the people who did do a little bit of research. Lois Kuiper Rushing down in Louisiana State University has cataloged all of Bozza's work from the point of view as a music librarian, but she hadn't done the biographical information. So she put me in touch with his daughter, and I eventually was able to go over there and do the archival work and the interviews and check out his conservatory and talk to the current director there and all that. So it was sort of an ongoing thing, but it all just grew out of my interest and admiration for his wind literature, especially that for the clarinet.
Lori, did you have a question? We're running a little low on time here, but we can probably.
Yeah, if we have just a quick second, I thought it was very interesting how you found examples and showed, the use of Sicilian, the use of tarantella, and bravura, violinistic kind of virtuosic moments. I was curious if maybe I missed it, but you showed a bit about kind of use of Indian ragas, and I wondered where that influence could have come from, because I didn't hear much about that before.
There had been already a tradition in French art music more generally, beginning in the 19th century with Francesco Salvatore Dali. He had cataloged a lot of North African modes at that point, and that sort of inspired an interest among a lot of French composers to be interested in non-Western modes and scales and so forth. And with exploration, imperialism, eventually globalization, there was just more knowledge about the modes used by other musics throughout the world. And this is one that I guess Bozza got particularly interested in. I haven't found specific information intriguing him in particular to Carnatic modes in particular, but he obviously was greatly intrigued by them, having written the etudes for clarinet based on them, and he wrote similar etudes for several other instruments as well. He put it into bucolique for the clarinet. He put it into agrestide for flute, and I believe an oboe piece as well, his Fantaisie Pastorale. So it's something he keeps coming back to. It obviously was meaningful to him. He maybe liked the way it sounded and so forth. But I believe it's all based on that 19th century French tradition, that fascination with modes that we see in Bizet and Gounod and so forth.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you, Lacey. Let's go on to the next presenter. This is Anderson Cesar Alves, coming to us from Brazil. Welcome. And his paper is called Clarinet Expert Teacher, Investigation on Pedagogical Practices in Music Performance. So thank you, Anderson. Let me make you able to share your screen.
Okay.
One moment. Oh yeah, there it is. All right, I think you are ready to go here. And I will make sure that you get your full 25 minutes, even though we're running a couple of minutes behind. So no hurry.
Okay. Okay, can you see?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, my name is Anderson Cesar Alves. I'm clarinetist from Brazil, from National Symphony Orchestra in Brazil, and researcher. And I'll present this paper, The Clarinet Expert Teacher, an investigation on pedagogical practices in music performance. Introduction. This paper is the result of a recently concluded doctoral research, which invokes a debate about the assessment of expert teachers in music performance. Sorry. I have to turn on here. Okay, and I have investigated the pedagogical practices in the field work underline the characteristics of the expert clarinet teacher, especially in Brazilian. I have investigated the pedagogical practices in the field work underline the characteristics of the expert clarinet teacher, especially in the Brazilian music scenario. This investigation aims at approximating research on teacher expertise in areas such as skill development, Dreyfus, 1980, Education, Berliner, 1988, and the NBBTS Platform, 2002, which presents the characteristics observed in the evaluation and certification of expert teachers in other areas of knowledge. This approach has raised questions about the use of these attributes to describe the qualities of the expert clarinet teacher. Research objective. This research aims at analyzing the teaching practices deployed by expert clarinet teachers. It also describes the approach resorted by these teachers in the development of a high-level instrumental performance. Research question: what pedagogical approaches are used by expert clarinet teachers to develop the high level of students' performance? Here is table 1. It consists in 8 fields of competencies, and in the first column I have the research of Dreyfus, 1980, Berliner, 1988, on the field of education, and BPTS Platform, 2002, and the fourth column is mine column, it consists in 8 fields of hypotheses that grounded the observation. Data generation instruments. The methodological framework employed here was based on cross-reference data obtained through 1. Concurrent protocol analysis, 2. Semi-structured interview with 3 teachers, and 3. Semi-structured interview with 3 students from each teacher. The criteria for the choice of the 3 teachers are directly related to the high level of their students. Professor Lucas has been a clarinetist for 50 years, of which 30 as a clarinet teacher. Professor Felipe has been a clarinetist for 38 years, of which 28 as a clarinet teacher, and Professor Gabriel has been a clarinetist for 31 years, of which 20 as a clarinet teacher. Concurrent protocol analysis. Structured lesson observation based on the descriptive model in Table 1 was grounded in concurrent protocol analysis, Erickson, 2006. The central assumption of concurrent protocol analysis is that it is possible to instruct participants to verbalize their thinking, that done in a way that does not alter the sequence and content of thoughts that mediate a completion of a task. The results of this is a process that should immediately reflect the information available during reflection, Erickson, 2006. 4 clarinet lessons were recorded with each of the 3 teachers involved in research, and each lesson was an average 2 hours long. Here is one photo of Erickson. Erickson was my co-advisor, and he taught me how to use his protocol. And Erickson was willing to guide me in the application of his protocol as a main data generating device of my research. He emphasized the importance of video recording the lessons of participant teacher. Thus, as soon as each observed class had ended, all the materials recorded by the video camera was downloaded to a computer. Next, the participant teacher was invited to analyze the record of their classes. The purpose of this action was to make this teacher recall their strategies and pedagogical decisions made during the lessons they were just finished. And unfortunately, Erickson passed at the end of the research and he didn't know the results. The adaptation made by me regarding the application of the protocol, following the Erickson's advice, was to record the classes while bearing in mind that, under no circumstances, either the recording or the teachers were to be interrupted for the purpose of questioning them about their actions. This required a continuous camera monitoring to record every activity and take notes about the minute they happened. Erickson noted that the retrospective analysis of the video together with my notes would be sufficient for the teacher to recall their memories, would not impair the fluency of the lessons, nor would it interrupt the natural development of the process until they were finished. Semi-structured interview with teachers. Semi-structured interview was based on a pre-established script with 8 questions directly related to the competencies constituting the fields in Table 1. Semi-structured interview with students. The work of musical instrument teacher is almost always developed in a relatively isolated way. Kruger 2000. In order to minimize the negative effect of this isolation with respect to direct access to the reality of the teaching learning process, I interviewed a group of 3 students for each teacher. Triangulation. Data were generated through the technique of triangulation between the data analyzed from the 3 collection instruments. Dizon and Lincoln 2006 defined triangulation as the combination of methods used to investigate an interrelated phenomenon from multiple and different angles or perspectives. Results. The observation and data collection protocols generated 320 gigabytes of data. Initially, my goal was simply to verify the pertinence of each field as regards pedagogical expertise and music performance, as shown in Table 1, in order to validate them. The profusion of that data allowed the re-evaluation of Table 1 and the creation of Table 2, review of domains of competency of the pedagogue expert in music performance. A proposal for mapping the competency of expert teacher, awareness of performance corporeality. The whole of the body in the expert systematic pedagogical strategies so remarkably observable in the data analysis was not described in Table 1. Here is a situation that was completely unexpected. They talked about the body, not the body that press finger and release finger. They talked about the body that understands the music, the musical understanding. And this finding in turn led to the elaboration of the final framework, Table 3, which I have named Domains of Competency of the Pedagogical Expert in Music Performance. Here is the Table 3, Domains of Competency of the Pedagogical Expert in Music Performance, and unfortunately I'll not have time to read it, but it has 7 fields of competence. Discussion. The expert teacher demonstrates a broad mastery of knowledge and practice of the complex pattern of music performance, which is a result of both their own expertise as a performer and the expertise that is amassed over decades of working as a music performance teacher. The expert teacher expanded visual allows them to use mental schemas represented visually, gesturally, as a way to convey thoughts, feeling, and musical understanding. The expert teacher is endowed with the awareness of performance corporeality, a methodology that targets not only the performer's motor ability to operate the musical instruments, but also the ways in which the performer understands music and each and every action embodied in music performance. The expert teacher holistically assesses the performance context and uses accurate patterns to recognize the learning process of their students. The expert teacher develops the ability to resort to the pedagogical decisions in order to circumvent performance problems through harnessing creative problem-solving strategies that suit the needs, characteristics, and potential of each student. The expert teacher works systematically in the refinement of perception and cognition in the context of performance while carrying this out with deliberate practice, self-regulation, and metacognition. The expert teacher's work is constantly updated and engaged in dialogue with contemporary reality, whose major aim is the formation of flexible musicians who are strongly connected to the contemporary world. In their role as a facilitator for the student learning experience, the expert teacher is readily resourceful. They speculate with tools and devices, which will succinctly said, smoothing route path, maximizing results, and bring up proposals aimed at practical understanding as well as overall reflection on performance. Discussion: individual characteristics of each teacher. The data analysis available led us to infer that each of the teachers possessed characteristics with by proximity related to research in psychology and education. Professor Lucas related to humanistic psychology, by which tenets the individual is seen as holistic being. Humanistic psychology has its origins in the major assumption of Abraham Maslow, who elevated it as an institution of the pyramid of needs. It was in the 50s that Maslow became one of the founders and driving forces behind the humanistic psychology school of thought. A quotation about Professor Humanist: I think that is the only thing I'm through to and do for everyone is that I like the human being and I have respect for them. I always have a lot of patience to be careful with all and try not to hurt everyone and make them cry, because first of all, I think of the human being. Only afterwards came the clarinet. Professor Gabriel, guided by the nature of his practices, I have conceived him as a cognitivist, inasmuch as the word cognition, from the Latin cognition, describes the process of acquiring knowledge. As held by cognitive psychology, this knowledge is directly connected to various mental behaviors. Steinberg, 2010, defined cognitive psychology as the study of how people perceive, learn, remember, or think or create schemes to process information. A quotation about cognitivist professor: I use schemes and perform a visual demonstration with my hands. At high points in the performance, I raise my hands. At low points, I lower my hands. And the results improve when the students understand these visual relationships. I draw a mind map based on visualization of melodic movement, and this is also a memorization strategy. Professor Felipe, I have defined him as a critical reflective teacher based on the influence of John Dewey, because the term reflective professional has as one of its roots the ideas of the latter, who influenced the work of many researchers to make use of the elements of reflection in order to improve their teaching task. Critical reflective, a quotation. If the student does not visualize the image and does not perceive this image reflected in his body, he is not doing anything. The choices are always to make that image clearer, to control these images in order to see what is happening. If the students can visualize this image, he can repeat this image. If it has clarity, weight, smell. Seeing in music is related to our listening. We have to be connected visually inward, but audibly outward, to perceive and feel the sensations and vibrations, hear the perception of vibration. But in general, the body has to visualize this internal image of what is happening. In my view, the excerpt above clearly support and align with the data presented herein, insofar as the question be posed. What smell and weight does the music have? And how can this mental image be reflected in the performer's body? Conclusion: the analysis of data generated through the observation protocol used in this research point out that the three teachers developed their own styles in teaching music performance. It was through deep analysis into their teaching practice that I identified their teaching styles to be in dialogue with research grounded in the field of psychology and education. The three teachers' different approaches by analogy related to school of thought, such as humanistic practice, cognitivist psychology, and critical reflective practices in education. Concomitantly, my findings was that this approach can, in turn, not only contribute to development of different forms of clarinet teaching, it can also effectively contribute to the achievement of a high level performance by students. This is my references, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Anderson. That's very, very interesting. I wonder if it would be helpful if you could put your presentation maybe back to table number 3, the last table that you created that that kind of had the final version of the competencies on it.
Okay, one moment.
Is that possible? That might be helpful that we could look at it.
Okay.
Making you do a lot of work, sorry.
Okay, no problem. Over here, table 1.
I was hoping for the last version of that table as you revised it.
Okay, the table 3.
Yeah, number 3.
Okay, over here.
Yeah. Right. I know I'm just supposed to be the organizer, but I have some questions, but I'd like to let the judges ask their questions first.
Okay, I'm not.
Can we see the second page of this too?
The second page? Okay, sorry, I have to.
Oh, no, sorry, the second page of that table, because it was like 2 seconds.
Okay.
We're
Sorry.
jump around, sorry.
Okay, this one.
There we go. Yeah, there was a lot of information on these, and I think it's good for us to be able to look at them a little bit and digest it.
So I guess I have 2 questions for you. The first one, I thought that your conclusions about comparing these teachers' different styles to psychology was really interesting. I could certainly see myself within there too. Is that something that you found in other research, or is that an idea that you had on your own?
No, I had at the first moment when I was researching, I started my PhD here in Brazil. I would like to know about expert teachers in music performance, and I came across papers just in areas such as skill development and education and the platform NBPTS for evaluation of professors in high school in the United States. But as I told, with Erickson's advice, I used the protocol analysis, and I recorded all the materials, and I came across 320 gigabytes of information.
Wow.
And to analyze all of that, I got sick. I had a pain in my elbows pain. Analyze all the material, but I think that I got it. And I came across with very professors that have been teaching at 30 years at the same school, same university. 30 years teaching, and Professor Lucas, he has 18 students. And one thing that his humanistic view, I was really interested in that, how to give class to 18 students and how to prepare, how to solve problems, how to one of his students loves popular music. chorinho in Brazil, chorinho. All clarinetist people play chorinho. I do play chorinho too.
I play choro too, actually.
Yes, and she loves to play chorinho. But in the final, the final test, what she played chorinho in her final recital, I think, and she played. And it was impossible in Brazil many years ago because it was you have to do this humanistic view. He changed according to the characteristics of the students. I think that we need to think about this in our pedagogical practices.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess my other question is, after going through this study, I'm assuming you teach too. How has your teaching evolved?
One thing that I have learned, I am a clarinetist from National Symphony Orchestra in Brazil. I play first clarinet and E-flat clarinet, and I do teach too. And one thing that I have learned with this my own research, and I'm using with my students too. The use of the body in the performance is not the body that press finger and release finger. It is not this body. It's the body that understands the music. How to understand? This is called embodied cognition. Embodied cognition. I always say to my students, bring your body into the performance. Bring your body. You are playing okay. You are playing really good, but bring your body. It doesn't mean to dance, like to move your body. It doesn't mean that. It's mean to understand the music, because fingers, it has memory, kinesthetic memory. Yes, that's it. And at the final of the research, I think every teacher they have their characteristics, and this research continues. And I went to the platform, the research platforms, and I love this phrase that the Professor Lucas said. I love to teach because I love human being. First, I like human beings. Second, the clarinet. And I thought this is a very humanistic view. And psychology, the humanist psychology, defining his professor, the psychology, humanistic psychology. And Professor Felipe, he's very critical. He criticizes all the things, but the same way he creates solutions. He criticizes, and every time it is a solution. And many of his students is in Germany. They are in Germany studying techniques, contemporary techniques in music performance. And Professor Gabriel is a professor that knows a lot about cognitive psychology, and he developed techniques to memorize pieces and this is the result. This is mine. I went to the platforms, and I thought that it could be possible to name them. That's it.
Thank you. Other
Understand.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question. I really found this to be fascinating. And I found myself, as you were explaining all of these things, thinking about not just myself as a teacher, but my teachers and what categories they might fall into, and how we can, continue to be better teachers for our students, and what kind of successes. But I actually was interesting thinking about Professor Gabriel, I believe you said, is the cognitive one who was, thinking about how people perceive and learn and remember things. And I think you mentioned he, would use his hands to create gestures and help them think about using their bodies. And I have studied a bit of Dalcroze's rhythmics, and it made me think about how we try and incorporate the use of your full body into playing or singing, so it's not just, as you mentioned, the fingers. And I thought there might be a next step there to maybe connect those who are cognitive psychology related teachers into who has done some eurythmics, or what that might look like if they did. I thought that was a neat connection there. I guess my question for you is, did you find that any of the three categories of teachers were like more successful with their students, or did you find them to be equally, like the students were all happy with those kind of teaching methods?
No, every professor, they have their own characteristics, and the results are incredible. But I have been studying cognitive psychology since 2011, and in my master, I have studied the expertise, but looking at the performer. How did they high level in their performance, and I came across there with a well-established way to study. They have been practicing deliberate practicing, the term coined by Carl Under Erickson that co-advised me, and here at Rio de Janeiro, for example, the professor used a lot of cognitive techniques to teach their students. I think that in the first book that they read is Deliberate Practicing, about all the papers about Erickson's, because over there it is possible to create techniques to memorize music. How to memorize music? You can use these techniques, and humanistic professor, he doesn't know, for example, this term deliberate practices, but the way that he teaches is by proximity, near, but just he doesn't know this. But the research that I have been looking show that the cognitive psychology is a support for the preparation. You can rely on that, read books, and read all the Erickson's book, the Williamson's book, Diana Deutsch book, that help a lot in the preparation of the performance, and the results are incredible.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think we need to stop for our break now, but you've generated a lot of questions and interesting thoughts with your presentation. So thank you very much.